Okay, well, welcome everybody to A Sailor's Life Live. This is our weekly program from the USS Constitution Museum in Boston, where we're coming to you live with a new topic about life at sea on board USS Constitution. So my name is Sarah. I'm an educator at the museum, and today we're going to be talking all about sailor food and meals. So what were the types of food that these sailors were eating out at sea in 1812? How did they eat and how did they prepare all this food? So it should be a pretty meaty topic for us to dig into, pun intended there, and I'm excited to learn about this together today. But I'm joined today by one of the active duty crew members on board USS Constitution. And I'm going to turn things over to him so that he can introduce himself to you all. And also, if you wouldn't mind, Jabari, tell us a little bit about where you are and about USS Constitution.
Yes, Sarah, definitely. Thank you again, Sarah. I am Airman Shabazz, but please feel free to call me Jabari. That is my first name. Airman Shabazz or Shabazz. We use that last name basis when we're being professional. But please feel free to call me Jabari. I am, as Sarah said, a USS Constitution sailor. I am active Navy. I've been at the USS Constitution for approximately 7 months now, and I'm loving every bit of it.
That's great. Well, I'm really glad you're joining us today. Can't wait to see what you have to show us there on the ship. So we're lucky to have you right there on USS Constitution. So we'll catch up with you in a little bit, Jabari, down on the berth deck, okay? While we dive into our topic here.
All right.
Okay, so everybody, before we get started, I do want to just point out two more features of Zoom that we're going to utilize today. The first is the Q&A. So if at any point you have a question for myself or for Jabari, you can share that question using the Q&A feature, and we'll do our best to answer those as we go along. And then there are going to be points during our program today where I ask a question of you all. So you can share your answers, your thoughts to that question in the chat feature as well. So while we actually, Jabari, while we have you there on the spar deck, do you mind giving us just a brief 1 minute, I know that's challenging, introduction to the ship and why she's so important? Just because I know we're pretty familiar. We have some, I'm sure, folks in the audience who are, but just to give us a good context before we get into our content today.
Definitely. So, as Sarah said, we are currently on the USS Constitution. If you can see some of the rigging and the mast behind me, what makes the USS Constitution so important to, well, frankly, the beginning of the Navy, or around that time period, and arguably the beginning of America, is that so you said keep it brief, so I'm trying really hard to keep it brief.
I know it's tough.
What makes it so important is that it is one of the last standing frigates, the original 6 frigates that were built during the 1797 or 94, excuse me, era. By last standing, this is the oldest commissioned warship afloat. Basically, briefly, what that means is that it is the oldest out of all the Navy's ships. It is still commissioned. It is not decommissioned. If you have seen any of our Facebook Live tours by the U.S. Constitution team, or if you've been here to Boston before, frankly, there is a old decommissioned World War II destroyer over there. It is the USS Castañón. That ship is strictly on a historical learning type perspective. But this, we set this ship out. We sell it every summer, approximately 7 times a year during the summertime period. So we're still able to set sail, and it is still a warship.
That's great. Yeah. So all these years later, 220 years, still kind of sharing the heritage of the Navy. And you guys are a big part of that. So again, thanks so much. We can't wait to see what you have to show us in a little bit when we check in with you down on the berth deck. So I want to now start by just testing out one of the features that I mentioned in Zoom, our chat feature, with a question for everybody. So we're going to start off. You can share your answers in the chat. to this question. I'm curious, if you were going to go on a long trip for a 6-month period of time, what is one food item that you would just have to have with you? You couldn't live without that item of food for the 6-month journey that you're about to go on. Let's see what's coming up in our chat. Ooh, we have some pancake fans, some corn, bread, Italian ice, ooh, fried fish. I'm coming over to your guys. You have some great ideas here. Lots of different appetites. But the types of foods that I'm seeing here, French fries, chocolate, waffles, that's not exactly the type of food that our sailors would have been eating on USS Constitution in 1812. So how do we know what these crew members were eating? Well, first, it's important to think about the Navy's job of provisioning this ship and packing up enough food that would last for up to 6 months at a time. So one of the big factors that went into that for the Navy, I'm going to pull up an image here on our screen, is just how many mouths they had to feed. So we're looking at an image now of a depiction of the crew of USS Constitution in 1812. Now, this shows us that there were a lot of crew members. There were anywhere from 450 to 500 crew members at this time. And each of these crew members, they were fed 3 meals a day. So you had your breakfast early in the morning at 8 a.m. You had your midday meal around noon, and that was considered your dinner. It was the longest meal and it was the largest meal of the day. And then you had a smaller supplementary meal, a supper that came at the end of the day. But again, for as many as 500 people, that's a lot of food that you're feeding these men. We're lucky that we still have today a lot of primary source records from this time period that help us understand just what they ate at this time. So this is a graphic that we see on the screen now that the museum has created based on some of these primary source materials. This comes from records and logs so that we know exactly how much food was stored and packed on the ship for 485 sailors to eat over a 6-month period in 1813. So you can see we'll get into some of these types of foods in a little more detail. But there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of pounds and gallons of food that are packed up in barrels and stored down in the hold of the ship underneath the water level and the very bottom of Constitution itself. So with all of this food on board, it was very clearly organized what sailors were rationed for each day of the week. A lot of times, if you're out at sea, we know from records that sailors found the days kind of blurred together. A lot of what you did was repetitive and the same thing day after day. But one of the ways you could actually tell what day of the week it was by what food you were served that day. So we're going to take a closer look now at Wednesday, because today is Wednesday. So we'll see if we were to go back in time on today in 1812, what would an enlisted sailor, a typical sailor, have been eating out at sea on Constitution today? Well, looking at our center column here, the first item that we have on our daily diet chart is pork. So I have a couple fake food items that I'm going to show you guys as we go through these. This is what I have to represent our pork ration. So it might look like a nice piece of roasted meat or something, but actually that's not the type of pork that we're talking about here. So when we see pork or beef on that diet chart, we're talking about salted meat. Salt was really the form of preservation on this ship. There's no refrigerator, there's no freezer like we have now. And so salting meat like pork or beef allowed it to dry out. It turns into something that's like beef jerky. I saw somebody would have brought that with them, so you're in luck. There's quite a bit of stuff like that on the ship. And it would be rehydrated, so it would be soaked in water again and then boiled before the crew would eat it. But it was affectionately called salt junk by many sailors at this time. So it gives you a sense of maybe how they felt about it day after day. But this was a key part of daily diet, whether it was a Wednesday or any day of the week, because receiving a pound of meat like this meant that it was the biggest source of protein that the sailors got. That protein was really important to giving them the energy that they needed to do their jobs on the ship. So we have our pork as the first item. Let's go back to the chart and see what else we have. I'm going to skip over the second item just for a moment to go down to the rice here. This represents another category of food in the sailor diet, things like rice or dried peas or dried beans, which could be boiled and prepared pretty easily in large quantities. It also stored really well in large quantities. So that was kind of a filling side dish that sailors would eat frequently on the ship. But our last two items on our Wednesday chart here are two items that sailors actually receive every single day of the week. We look beyond Wednesday on either side. So we're gonna spend a little time just looking at each of these. We have our bread is the first one, and then we have our spirits. Again, both which sailors received every day of the week. Now, when we talk about bread on USS Constitution, we are not talking about our fluffy sandwich bread or anything like that. We are talking about this here. So this is called a ship's biscuit. And hopefully you can see it's a round, semi-flat piece of bread, we'll call it. But what you can't tell just by looking at it, I'm gonna knock a couple of pieces of the bread together. This is extremely hard. I can try really hard to break it. I promise I am trying. This is hard. And that's because it's essentially a mix of a lot of flour, a little bit of water, and then it's baked for a long period of time in an oven. I see someone says it looks kind of like a cookie. It does look a lot like a cookie. More like a cookie maybe than a piece of bread, huh? So what was good about this though, was because it was so hard, it had baked off for a long time, was that it lasted for months and months at a time. Actually, we'll talk just in a minute about how long one of these ship's biscuits can last. But the very thing that made it keep for a long period of time made it really difficult to eat. So I could try to take a bite out of this right now, but I would probably break a tooth, and I don't really want to do that. So I want to ask you guys in the chat if you have some ideas. How do you think sailors who were given 3 to 4 of these ship's biscuits every day, how do you think they made these edible or more appetizing? What are some ways that it could have made it a little easier to eat? Oh, I see some good ideas coming in our chat. So a lot of you are saying things like soak it or boil it or put it in liquid. That's a really great way to make it softer, right? Sailors were given a half a gallon of water, fresh water every day. And so they could choose to use a bit of that to kind of, right, soften it up, get it as something that was a little easier to eat. But we also, I think, have an idea that might not be the first one to come to our minds. And that is, think of this ship's biscuit as an ingredient rather than something that you eat on its own. So you might have noticed in our diet chart that there were certain days of the week where sailors got things like molasses and suet, which is animal fat that's hardened. So sailors could choose to take some of their ship's biscuit, mix it with some of these other rations they got during the week, and create an entirely different dish. So we have something like dandyfunk. It's a really fun word, but it's pretty much like a bread pudding that's made of that molasses, pieces of ship's biscuit, and some fat. And then it's baked off so that the biscuit kind of absorbs those flavors and it becomes a little more flavorful. If you want something more savory, you could go for something like lobscouse. I have this with me here. We have it in a tin. This is a dish that sailors would have been eating a lot of this food out of, the enlisted sailors. But if you look closely, this lobscouse, it's essentially a stew made of different ration items that sailors receive daily. So we have some pieces of ship's biscuit that are showing up in here. I see some salt junk, maybe some beef, it looks like some leftover. And then there's even some vegetables, root vegetables like onion or potato that they might have had on hand while they were closer to a port and they had those provisions before they spoiled. So you had some options with the ship's biscuit. You could get a little creative, maybe band up with a couple of your fellow shipmates and make something that was a little more appetizing. Now, I said we go back to how long this ship's biscuit lasts, because I want to show you all something in our collection that I think is really interesting. So we have this ship's biscuit on display in the museum's galleries. And this is a biscuit that was served on board USS Constitution. So that must mean that this has been around for a little bit of time. I want to hear from you guys. How old do you think this biscuit is? I'm going to launch a poll. You should see that there are a couple options showing up for how many years old you think this ship's biscuit is. I'll give you guys a chance to guess. We have anywhere from 25 years old to 150 plus years old. Let's take a look here. Well, we got some guesses rolling in. And it looks like, according to our audience, we are pretty overwhelmingly guessing that this ship's biscuit, we have 67% of us and rising guessing that the biscuit is over 150 years old. Well, you guys are correct. So this biscuit, we believe it was baked in 1854, and the biscuit was served on the ship in 1861. So that makes this biscuit over 160 years old, which is pretty incredible that it's still around today. We believe that a sailor, he saved this biscuit as a souvenir of his time on Constitution. I don't know, maybe we can ask Jabari later if he would save a ship's biscuit, but I think it's pretty interesting that in 1861, the sailor chose to save this biscuit as a memory of his time on the ship. Thinking of it as something that he saw day after day is pretty neat. And don't worry, we have no plans to make lobscouse or dandyfunk out of this biscuit. It's pretty neat to just see it, that it still survives today. So really quickly, I'll just address that last food item on the daily chart, and that was the spirits. So we know that every day of the week, sailors were given a ration of grog. And grog is essentially a mixture of water and alcohol. So it was half water, half whiskey or rum at this time. And it was served to sailors in a very controlled fashion. So I'll show an image of that quickly. Here's a depiction of our sailors. Around midday, they would have heard the drum of the Marine to indicate that it was time to receive their grog ration. They would hear their name called and they would proceed to the scuttlebutt or the grog tub. We'll explain those terms in a little bit, where they would get their grog ration. They'd have to drink it right on the spot. It'd be marked off that they received it, and then they would move on to their midday meal. So definitely something that was very controlled, but it was certainly a time of the day that the sailors looked forward to. So there's a crash course on a Wednesday in 1812 of what our sailors would have been eating. But I want to check back in with Jabari now, who we can see he's moved to a different area of USS Constitution, a different part of the ship. Jabari, can you tell us a little bit more about where these enlisted men would have been eating their food and talk to us about that mess experience?
Definitely, Sarah. So, as Sarah said, I moved to a different position on the ship. I'm currently on the berth deck of the ship. This is the third or second covered deck, but the third deck of the ship. And as she mentioned a little bit before, this is the living arrangements and the eating arrangements of the Constitution sailors. Back then, there was a really big distinction or a really big separation between the living quarters of the sailors and the commissioned officers. And all of these sailors, all 450-ish of them, were stationed here on the berth deck, as you can see behind me. As far as eating arrangements, which Sarah tapped into a little bit earlier, so come this way real quick. When the Constitution sailors were eating, they would eat in groups called messes, anywhere from 8 to 10 a group of people. And they would have something like what I have now, which is, well, not specifically this type of sheet, but a sheet made of canvas, something like the sails would be made of. And they would take these canvas sheets, lay them out on the deck, and they would sit in a group and call messes, and they would eat.
Yeah, that's great. It's so, Jabari, can you show us the area that we have here? There's like two big structures that it looks like you put that mess cloth down between. And would there have been messes between each of those along the whole way of the ship?
Definitely, Sarah. So, as in terms of exactly where they would eat, yes, these two big structures that she's talking about are called knees. These are knees are basically structural support points of the ship. Above us is the gun deck. If you've seen any of the Facebook Live tours, you'll know that the gun deck had plenty of long guns that weigh over 6,500 pounds each. And so these knees up and down the bulkhead of this ship on both sides really support and take some of the pressure off of the deck right above us. It kind of distributes the weight evenly. But yes, to answer your question, they'll eat between the knees, just about anywhere that you could get a group of people around to eat, any available spaces. Because keeping in mind that we're also, if we're not in port and it's time to eat and we're out in the ocean, the ship's rocking and whatnot, there's people still moving about. You still have people manning the fighting tops, you still have people working in sails up and down, people standing watches. So wherever you could get a space to eat is where they would eat, but it would be on the birthday.
That's great. That's a really good point, right? The ship still has to function if you're out at sea at dinner time. Can't just kind of drop everything and go eat. So thanks so much for showing us that. I just have one image to supplement, but Jabari, we'll catch you up on the gun deck in a little bit to show some of the spaces up there. So thank you for that.
All right.
Like I mentioned, I have one image just to show kind of what that deck would look like when it's populated with all of these enlisted men eating here. So exactly like Jabari showed us, they would put down that cloth that he had. This was called a mess cloth, and they would eat sort of picnic style down on the deck like that. These messes were, like we heard, between 8 and 12 sailors, and they had a chest here. We can see this wooden chest where they would have stored things like that mess cloth, the tin dishes they were eating out of, maybe any spices they had to make their meals a little more appetizing. But also had an important role within the mess that is going to come up in a few of the images we look at here. So this sailor right in the center, this was someone known as a mess cook. So this was a job that rotated among every member of the mess. You were a mess cook for about a week at a time, and it was your job to get the food to your messmates. So as we'll see in just a moment, the area where food was prepared and cooked on the ship is in a different part of the ship. So these mess cooks would use these wooden buckets called kids to bring the dish down to the rest of their messmates. Mess cooks were also really important and helpful for making some of those sailor recipes like the dandyfunk or the lobscouse. And just another thing that I think is interesting looking at this picture here, this illustration, is we get a real sense of kind of the community that these sailors had when they were able to eat together like this. It's important to know that sailors could choose their messmates, so they could choose who they wanted to eat with. And that was kind of a rare example of choice that they had here. So they did have these communities where they were able to join in their meal together. And I know we've been looking at their food and we've been thinking, ooh, I don't know if I want to try that with all of those other things I could have brought on my 6-month journey. But I just want to remind everyone to think about this from the perspective of these 1812 sailors, because this food, this daily food rations for the enlisted men here was actually a big draw of joining the Navy, along with, of course, getting that monthly salary that you had. you were given food every day, and you were given a lot of food every day. Many of these enlisted men were actually eating better on the ship, especially with access to a pound of meat every day, than they might have had on land. So something to consider while we in 2020 are looking at these sailor food here. And very quickly, before we leave the berth deck discussion, I want to show you an image that actually referenced something Jabari talked about down there, which was that the experience of officers, commissioned officers on this vessel was very different than the enlisted men that we just saw. So this is an image of the wardroom, which is actually just down the berth deck from the place Jabari showed us. And we see in this image a lot of different eating experience, we'll call it. So if you guys notice some of these differences, you can feel free to share those in the chat. But I want to point out just a few that stand out to me. First of all, I'm seeing that these commissioned officers, they are eating on a table with a tablecloth and chairs. So they have furniture, right, for them to eat their meal. If you were able to tune in last week to Emily's program about sailor chores, you also might have learned that these officers were eating on dishes that were a lot different than our enlisted sailors. So we can see evidence of that in this image where they have these stemmed glasses. They look like wine glasses that we're used to seeing, but this, what would have been something like porcelain or china for them to eat on as well. And what is not as clear in this image is that the food that these officers were eating was also different. So officers had the opportunity to pool together money and use that to buy food that they could supplement rations with. So they would go out and purchase themselves what we see evidence of here, some different beverage options, but also some fresh food, fresh meat. They had livestock that they would utilize on board for eggs or cheese or dairy, all these types of things that as officers they had access to. So certainly one of the privileges that came with rank. And it's important just to note that different dining experience between the different members of the crew. Now, before I turn things back over to Jabari to show us some of the spaces on the gun deck of the ship, I want to talk about our next overall topic, which is how was all of this food prepared? Well, we did have a cook on the crew, and we know in 1812 that one of the cook's names, or there was only one cook, but his name was William Long. And William Long was actually a member of the crew during the War of 1812 who was injured in a battle. He lost the use of one of his arms as a result of that injury, and he stayed on as part of the crew, became the cook after he was injured. So he's one crew member responsible for preparing all this food. And he would have some help from those mess cooks or other mates, but he had an area of the ship that Jabari is going to show us now that he used to really prepare all of these meals. So Jabari, can you tell us more about this area of the ship on the gun deck, some of those spots related to food there?
Definitely, Sarah. So right now we're on the gun deck, and behind me is this big, huge metal structure is called the caboose. This is the ship's oven. This is the ship's stove. This is even the ship's microwave, although they didn't microwave food back. Here, as Sarah said before, this is where all the food was prepared. Food for the regular sailors as well as the commissioned officers, although separated, distributed amongst them differently. This is where it all went down. One thing I want to hit on, or some people ask questions about this during our in-person tours and even on Facebook Live, that the caboose would not be fired up all day, every day. That is a huge fire hazard that they had to mitigate. And in order to mitigate that, they only fired it up at noon. So that means that your breakfast was your leftovers from the prior day dinner, and your dinner was cooked usually from lunch, or yes, your dinner would be from lunch and your breakfast would be from the prior day. As far as manpower, as Sarah said, it was only one person cooking back then, if need be, because different things going on, whether it be a battle just happened and there may have been a couple losses of personnel or not. But generally, the cook and the cook's assistant were the only people that were touching this caboose.
Yeah, that's so I have trouble cooking for myself or one other person. I can't imagine cooking for that many people, right? That would be wild. Jabari, can you show us, there are a couple other areas nearby, right, that are related to food on the ship. Can you show us some of those, like the scuttlebutt and the steep tub?
Definitely, sir. So there are three different structures, or three different structures that we have here aboard the USS Constitution that Sarah mentioned earlier. Right now, this is our steep tub. As she mentioned earlier, the steep tub would be for the salt junk that she mentioned. You would have it soaking here with water. You would have your really salted meat dried out, soaking here for 24 hours prior to putting it on the caboose to cook. So, and every 4 hours, they would rotate the water. So the purpose of this was to get all of that salt that was on the meat to really take out as much as you could, because the last thing you want is a dehydrated sailor. You only get a allotted amount of water, fresh water a day. So they would try to mitigate some of that dehydration and soak your meat in here. Our next structure right here is the grog tub. The grog tub is where all of the spirits would be at. Usually, when they were rationing out their grog, there would usually be a Marine soldier here, and there would be, when they're rationing out the grog, it's part alcohol, part water. And so to make sure that they drink it on the spot, you would have someone here manning, doing some type of security on the grog tub to make sure they wouldn't take it out, save it for later, and then, have some type of party or something like that. So it was always drunk on the spot. This is where they stored it in. And our last structure is the scuttlebutt. The scuttlebutt is where the fresh water would be rationed out. Normally, if you're actually storing water, like mass quantities, it would be on the orlop deck. However, if they're rationing it out, it's time to eat, or something like that, they would have it here in the scuttlebutt. Little known fact, scuttlebutt is a two-part kind of word, or the word scuttle and the word butt have two different meanings, but together, this is the structure that you get. The scuttle is the hole that you see right here, and the scuttle is the measurement, and the butt part of the word is the actual hole here. So
you were so close. You had it right the first time.
Okay.
Yep.
So that would be the measurement of the amount of water that is in the barrel here. Scuttle anywhere from, if I'm not mistaken, anywhere from like 140 to 160 gallons of water, and but the other part is the hole that you see here in the barrel.
And what I think is kind of fun is that scuttlebutt is still a word that we may hear today. Sometimes I've heard it used as, what's the scuttlebutt, or something like gossip. And that comes from this area where you're gathered to get food, right? If we think of that in other settings, if you're at a water fountain at school or something, it's a place where you gather and talk while you're waiting your turn to either get your ration of water or just to get water today. So thank you for showing us all that, Jabari. I think it's neat just to point out that connection to today as well. So I just want to show a couple images quickly before we wrap up and take questions related to what you just showed us there on the gun deck. Now, what we're looking at now is a photograph of a caboose or a stove on another historic ship. This is the caboose of HMS Victory, which is a British ship, a much larger ship from this same time period. And they have it decked out so we can see a little bit of how this would have functioned. Like Jabari mentioned, this stove is powered by fire, but they're very careful about when they light this fire because this is a wooden ship. We have to be careful with open flames, but that is the way that we're cooking the food. And we have all these pots and pans and kettles that give us a sense of the types of tools Long and the cook assistant would have used to make these meals. Lastly, just one illustration here that shows all of this in action, right? So this is the caboose area of the ship. right around that midday meal. And we can see we have evidence of our salt junk that's being soaked in this steep tub that Jabari showed us before it's put in the camboose. There's boiling off the meat here so that it's warmed up and more appetizing. Here's our cook, William Long. He's using a tool that, again, if you tuned in last week, Emily told us this giant meat fork here is called a tormentor, and he would use that to help get the meat out of the camboose and serve it to our mess cooks who are lined up and waiting to bring the food to the rest of their mess. Very quickly, there's some evidence of officer food in this image. So on either end, we have over on this side a crew member who's heading off into the distance. It looks like he's holding a platter with like a nice piece of roast meat. That's pretty guaranteed going to the officers there. And then on the other side of the image, we have some of our livestock that would have been on board the ship. So here's a couple goats. These goats would have provided some of that fresh dairy or cheese, or maybe even fresh meat for officers on board. But we would have had goats or pigs or chickens. These were the types of live animals that would have been on the ship. And a little evidence too of some of the mess they might have left on the ship as well. So this, we're running close to our time, but I do want to just say here that we've covered a lot about food. There is still a lot to talk about when it comes to food on board Constitution. So we'll do our best to answer a couple of questions that might have come up before we wrap up. And I have a quick question though, another one for Jabari actually, because since, you know, we still have our crew on Constitution today, I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about what the food is like for you all in the crew now, and hopefully maybe how some of that experience has changed since 1812.
Definitely. So it's I have to say, first things first, it is nothing like it is today, like it was back then. As far as preparing food, where you would eat. So nowadays we call our cafeteria or eating areas galleys. That is the section where the food is prepared and delivered as far as eating area. Like today we used your regular normal ingredients that you would use to cook any other meal outside of the Navy. Except we don't eat in messes, we don't eat on the floor, we have tables, things like that. But it's your standard modern way of eating food that we come to know today.
And how about the types of foods that you guys are served? Are you guys getting some lobscouse tonight, or?
No, so no more salted junk or anything like that. I think today we have, so usually in the morning time, depending on what command you're at and how they prepare their food, particularly here at the USS Constitution, when we eat in our galley, the breakfast is made to serve. So we have eggs, bacon, sausage, waffles if you want those, pancakes, things like that. Lunchtime, you might see something a little bit more simpler. You might see burgers or something like that. And then in the dinner time, we would have. So I've seen lasagna. I've seen fish. It's just again your modern day foods. None of the salted junk. No more putting stuff in the steep tub or anything like that.
Oh, well, I have to admit, I'm glad to hear that for you guys. So as interesting as it is, right, to hear about these different types of foods, it is, I see someone said in the chat, you seem to have a lot better food, at least certainly to our 2020 palates, right? That sounds a lot more familiar to us. So thank you for sharing that perspective. I think it's really interesting. So I just want to, we have time for a couple questions. Let me see what came up for us here. Oh, here's a good one, Jabari. I know we get this question a lot. I'm sure you guys are asked too. Did they eat fish? They probably did because they were right there, but I'm asking just in case. Do you want to take a stab at that, Jabari?
Sure, definitely. So as you mentioned earlier, Sarah, there were sometimes cattle on the ship, chickens, cows, pigs, and those would be prepared and dished out. They did, if they were going to different ports, they would buy supplements of fish, and they would cook those every once in a while. I couldn't tell you how often, but there have been reports of them eating fish the USS Constitution crew, yes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think one thing I'll add is just that the Navy did equip ships at this time with trolling fishing nets, just acknowledging that that was a way to get some fresh food, right? So it was pretty infrequently that sailors would have actually been able to fish on Constitution. They had to be going pretty slowly to be able to actually catch anything, but that was another way for them to get that. Otherwise, if they couldn't eat it fresh, they could have had salted fish. So we did have salted cod on the menu. I'm glad I don't have that with me now because it's pretty smelly, but that was another option for a fish as well. Okay, let's see. Here's another question. Do they use utensils or did they use their hands? Well, they did have utensils on the ship. So a lot of times sailors would, enlisted sailors would bring their own, whether it was a wooden utensil like this. For those officers, they would also bring their, they could have their own, but they would use silverware and even sometimes silverware that was embossed with their own personalized. And one last question that I'm seeing here, were there fires on the ship? So Jabari, do you want to take a stab at that question?
Sure, definitely. So, fires. Yes, I could probably assume, yes, there probably were. Very few, though, seeing how the Constitution is still standing here today with us. As far as your highest chance of a fire happening would be on the gun deck, for the reason that we have all of these long guns here, and when they shoot back, when they shoot their shots out of the guns, sometimes sparks and things like that will go flying everywhere. And so we talked about this a lot during our Facebook Live tours, but so during gun rotation, doing gun drills and whatnot, or actually being in the middle of the heated battle, what you would see on the gun deck here is not just your regular wooden deck. You would have the gun deck soaked in water. It would be a little bit low beneath your ankle, but not too much. But there would be sand on the deck as well. So there'd be sand for traction through the water, so no one would slip or anything like that, but you would still have water to catch those sparks so you wouldn't spark any fires. And again, with the caboose, they only fired up the caboose once a day. And that was at noon. So everything else was leftovers besides your lunch, what would be your freshest meal. But yes, I'm sure there were some, but there were very few.
Yeah, that's right. Like this is a wooden warship, so we have to be really careful about when we use fire. Certainly, you're right. A real danger is operating those guns, and so they did have some methods to prevent fire there, and also protecting the powder as well. And the only other source that I'll say is that there were some incidents reported of accidental fires that were put out very quickly from candles. So there were, in some of those officers, they had their own private spaces. They weren't allowed to stay up late reading at night by candlelight because if they accidentally fell asleep, as there are records of one, I believe it was a surgeon who fell asleep with his candle still lit, and they were able to put out a small fire, but definitely something that's on their radar. All right, everybody. Well, I think that's all the time we have, unfortunately. We do have some good questions in there, so I thank you guys for asking those questions, for being so engaged in our program, and maybe we'll have to have another session about food if it finds out there's more to do. I do have one challenge for everybody to kind of continue their learning here after today. And that is to go onto our website, usscn.org, where we have these recipes for our sailor meals. So if you are thinking, I'm dying to try one of these meals that we talked about today, well, you have the chance to do that. You can make your own ship biscuit, you can make your own dandyfunk, give it a try and see what you think. You can make it with someone and share that meal and tell them a little bit about what you learned today. So there should, I see Emily shared that link in the chat, so feel free to follow that to find some of these sailor recipes. But we thank you guys so much for joining us today, and we hope you enjoyed learning just a little bit about sailor food on this ship. Jabari, do you have any final words for our group before we sign off today?
Yes, one thing I feel like I'm obligated to put out is that we do have Facebook Live tours every day. at 10 on the USS Constitution. So you'll have a different sailor every time, giving you their interpretive, historical point of view on the Constitution, what went down, how did things operate, such as the gun deck, berth deck, and spar deck as well. Facebook Live, USS Constitution, every day, 10 o'clock.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, thank you. Because I think I encourage everyone to check those out. Just like Jabari said, we have all kinds of sailors every day who are sharing much more of the ship than we were able to see in this program. So if you're still curious, definitely check those out. And again, check out the museum's website. And we'll be back with another A Sailor's Life Live next week with a brand new topic about life at sea on board this ship. So Jabari, thank you so much. It was so great to work with you. And thank you to our cameraman behind the scenes on Constitution as well. And thanks to everyone else for joining. So take care, everybody. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.